Steve, take us through the Supreme Court challenge and what it was about.
Sure, Bev. What they had to do was the Supreme Court, 5 judges, had to make a decision about whether the Scottish Parliament were allowed to pass a bill so they could have an indicative referendum on Scottish independence next October, which First Minister Nicola Sturgeon was hoping to push through in October next year. So they had to make a ruling about whether the Scottish Parliament had those powers. And to take us all back, remember we had a referendum in Scotland about independence back in 2014, and that was done under the consent of Westminster, the Parliament at the time. The then Prime Minister David Cameron allowed that to happen, and the vote ended up being 55-45 to stay. Now, it looked like that was probably resolved for a generation, except along comes the Brexit vote in 2016. And during that vote, the Scots voted 62-38 to remain inside the European Union. And so we saw a situation where Britain had voted out, but the Scots wanted to stay in. And in fact, I remember catching a train to Edinburgh a couple of days after that Brexit vote and some wag yelling out as I got off the train, "Welcome to Europe." So there were a lot of people who wanted to stay in the European Union. And so then suddenly there was this momentum for a second referendum. But they couldn't have it without the consent of Westminster, and successive Conservative governments have denied the Scottish nationalists the right to have a second independence referendum. So Nicola Sturgeon wanted to have her own one, nothing that would be binding, but it would be an indicative vote on where Scotland was at on the question of independence, and she was hoping to have that in October next year. And to have that bill go before the Scottish Parliament, the Supreme Court had to make a decision. And that decision was handed down about an hour ago. In the first case, they decided they had jurisdiction to make a decision on this. And then what they said was that the Scottish Parliament really did not have the right to hold this referendum or to pass a bill that would lead to this referendum because it related to reserved matters. And what they were saying there was that under the Scotland Act, when the Scottish Parliament was set up by the Parliament in Westminster, that they were given jurisdiction over certain matters, like things like schools and hospitals, but not over these reserved matters. And to set up a referendum relating to leaving the Union was considered a reserved matter by the court. So that won't be going ahead, that referendum in October next year.
Yeah, so where does this leave the push for independence from the UK for Scotland?
Well, as a political issue, it won't go away because people are still talking about it. It's just that there's no mechanism you can see of how they will have a referendum. Obviously, those successive UK Conservative governments since Cameron have said that they don't really want to have a second referendum. They consider the issue to be resolved, and they consider there to be other priorities at the moment. Nicola Sturgeon said in June, before this court heard all the various arguments, that if the court did not rule in the favour of what she wanted, that the next general election, that the SNP would campaign purely on independence, on no other issues like health and education and those kind of issues you normally see, or the economy, that you normally see dominate a general election. So she wants to make the next general election in those Scottish seats purely a referendum on independence. Now, whether the other parties agree to that will remain to be seen, but we all know that general elections are about multifaceted issues, so it'll be very hard for her to make that case. But what she wants to be able to say is after the next general election that over 50% of voters in Scotland voted for pro-independence parties, therefore we have a mandate to have an independence referendum. Yep. So look, the issue is not going to go away, but it's hard to see Westminster consenting to a second referendum at this stage.
Yeah, so what has the reaction been? I mean, I remember Nicola Sturgeon during the circus that politics has become in Britain, saying she really was done with it all. Has she said much, or has there been much reaction to today's decision?
Nicola Sturgeon is due to give a statement on camera in about half an hour, but she has just tweeted. She said, while she's disappointed, she respected the decision of the Supreme Court. She said it doesn't make law, it only interprets it. And she says a law that doesn't allow Scotland to choose our own future without Westminster exposes as myth any notion of the UK as a voluntary partnership and makes the case for another independence referendum. So in a sense, she's saying the Scotland Act should be changed to give Scotland the powers. That would be up to Westminster. It's unlikely that that's going to happen. She then goes on to say, Scottish democracy will not be denied. Today's ruling blocks one route to Scotland's voice being heard on independence, but in a democracy, our voice cannot and will not be silenced. And Bev, in a couple of hours' time, we're going to have Prime Minister's questions here at Westminster. No doubt SNP MPs will get up and ask the Prime Minister, Rishi Sunak, questions about whether he's going to have would consent to a second referendum. And you can expect that the argument being pushed by the government will be, well, hang on a second, there's a cost of living crisis here. We've got other things on our plate. There's a war in Ukraine. We're trying to get inflation down. That's what we consider to be the important issues at this moment, not a second independence referendum.
Yeah, interesting development. Steve, good to talk. Thanks so much.